CSS Grid is very complex but very powerful. It allows you to create any kind of layout you can imagine. In this video, you will learn how to position elements on the grid by replicating a creative layout that looks something like this. You will learn how grid template columns and grid template rows work in detail and how to utilize developer tools when you're dealing with CSS Grid. Let's dive in. The setup for this demo is straightforward. We have a couple of elements on the page here, and I've added a little bit of styling to those elements. We have a div element with the class grid, which is going to be container for our entire layout. And then inside of that, we have an image, headline, text, and social icons. We're going to tweak styling here and turn this into an interesting layout like I've shown you moments earlier. Let's jump to CSS now. And as you see, there is a little bit of styling applied to the page. And we're going to start by working with the grid container. I'm going to remove this margin here. And the first thing that we will do is, of course, we will change the display here to grid. This container is already taking the full inline dimension of the page or full width of the page, but it's not taking the full height or full block dimension. So that is exactly what we're going to set next. We're going to set block dimension to be at least the size of the viewport because we want this to stretch entirety of the available space. So we will set minimum block size to 100 viewport block. And this is actually the equivalent of minimum height property, but it's a logical one. And viewport block unit is in this particular case equal to viewport height. If you want to learn more about logical CSS properties, I have an in-depth guide right here on YouTube. Link is going to be on screen and in the description, so check it out. So now that our container stretches entirety of the viewport, we actually want to create some kind of a grid system. And I'm thinking we're going to create 12 columns and 12 rows, and this will give us a lot of flexibility to place elements exactly where we want them. First, we will create 12 columns, grid template columns, and we want to set 12 columns, and we want those columns to be of equal size. And the most straightforward way to create 12 columns would be to just write one fraction unit, one fraction unit, one fraction unit 12 times. But the easier way, of course, is to use repeat function, which will repeat exactly the column size as many times as we want. So let's do that. Grid template column is going to be repeat 12 times, one fraction unit. And this will create 12 columns. And for rows, we want to do something similar. Grid template rows is going to be repeat 12, but instead of one fraction unit, we will set this to auto. I'm not going to go into grid sizing in this particular video. I'll focus on that in one of the next videos. Here, we will just focus on placing elements on the grid exactly where we want them. In any case, we have our grid here, but those elements we have are just placed automatically, which doesn't look like anything. So we will now position them on our grid. And to make it a little bit easier to follow, I will hide all elements except for the ones that we're currently working on. So first, we will position our image element, and I will just set display to none on headline, text, and social icons list. And my container for social icons is just social minus icons class. So this is what I'm going to add here. And display is going to be set to none. All right, I've opened developer tools now. And if you want to see exactly how your grid looks, you can always inspect it. So I'm going to find my grid element here. And if you set display grid to any element, you're going to have toggle, and if you click it, you're going to see exactly how your grid is set up. So you can see here where our columns and rows are defined, and apparently our image here is on the first column and it stretches as much as it needs to, and the rest of the columns and rows are smaller because we're setting them as one fraction unit, or take as much of the available space as you have, which is all the space here except for the image, divided equally among those columns and rows. As you can see, all of those empty columns are equally sized, just as well as empty rows. When you're working with CSS Grid in Developer Tools, you want to jump into the Layout tab here in Developer Tools, and you want to set display settings for your grid, and you want to show line numbers or line names if you're using line names, and you want to show track sizes, maybe area names, or whatever it is that you want to see. If your view becomes cluttered, you can hide some of those labels. As for right now, I'm going to leave show line numbers enabled, and I will hide everything else. We don't have area names, and we will not be extending grid lines because our grid is going to be stretching entirety of our viewport. So this is not going to be relevant right now. Now that we see where our grid is, we actually want to position our image somewhere along top left side of the screen, but not exactly at the top left. So I will set this in Developer Tools. I will select my image element, and I will set on my image class grid-colum start. And this image should start at the column 2, which is going to be this column right here. So I will set it to 2. And we want the image to stretch for at least a couple of columns. Let's set it so it stretches from column 2 to column 8. Let's see how this looks. And in this particular case, grid column end is going to be 8. So what we're doing here is we're positioning our image on the grid system that we created with 12 columns that starts at the column 2. And you see designation right here. This is our second column, and all the way to the column 8, which is going to be end for our image. Alternatively, you don't have to specify exactly at which column you want the element to stop. You can specify how many columns you want this item to span, and you will do this by specifying grid column end again. And you can set span keyword with the number of columns you want this item to span. In our case, this is going to be 6. And you don't see any difference here because this works exactly the same way. It starts at the column 2 and it spans 6 columns, which means that it's going to end at the column 8 exactly as we had before when we specified it manually by setting it to strict value 8. If you wanted this to stretch more, you can tweak this number and you can maybe make it span 7 columns or 8 columns. And as I'm tweaking this, you will see exactly that my grid is changing. So this is working exactly as you would expect. I will leave this at 6. And another thing that I want to show you is that there is a shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. And you specify it using the grid column property. I will comment out all of the properties we've created, and I will specify another one, grid column. And the first value that you specify here is going to be grid column start. So we will use value 2 as we did before. And when you want to specify column end, you're going to use the slash character. And after the slash character, you're going to specify the value for your column end, which can be 8 like we had in our first example, or span 6 if you want to specify number of columns we want this element to span. So I'll set this to strict 8 value. And now this element is stretching from column 2 to column 8 on our grid system. And if I expand this in developer tools, you're going to see that this exactly sets longhand properties, grid column start and grid column end. The next thing that we want to do now is we want to set this image on our grid rows. And this works exactly in the same way. You will specify grid row start and grid row end. And you can also use span keyword to make it span number of columns, or you can use strict values. And exactly as with grid column, you can use shorthand values, which would be grid row. So I will set this right now, grid row. We don't want it to be exactly at the top edge of the container. We want it to be a little bit lower. So our starting value or starting row is going to be 2. And let's set our ending row to 7. And please note that when I'm talking about numbers like I'm doing right now, we're setting this element on the columns 2 to 8 or rows 2 to 7. This is actually just a matter of playing around with those values. Try one thing, try another thing, and tweak those values as long as necessary until you get exactly the result that you want. In any case, grid row is going to be set to 2/7. And as you can see here on our preview, our image is not stretching entirety of the space that we assigned to it. This image starts at column 2 and goes to column 8. And for rows, it starts at row 2 and it stretches until row 7. And the line for the 7 is right here. So you see that there is some empty space right here. This is what we're gonna tweak next to stretch this image entirety of this available grid area. What we can do here is we can set width and height of this image to 100% and we'll get the result exactly like we want. So let's try this. And I will set inline size and block size to 100%. And block size is going to be 100% as well. And now the image is filling entirety of our grid area, but it is distorted, and we can very easily deal with this distortion if we're using object fit property. And object fit allows you to define how this image will be rendered. So let's set object fit property. And there are a number of values you can choose from, like contain, cover, fill, and those do different things. Like fill will fill entirety of the element exactly as we have initially. Cover will ensure that entirety of the element is filled, but the image will not be distorted, and contain will actually show you entirety of the image without distorting it. What we want here is we want cover. And as you see, this does exactly what we want. It fills up entirety of our available space without distorting an image. And there's also a way to position the image within those boundaries that we've created right now. And this can be done using the object position property. And this again allows you to specify where this image is going to be positioned within this available space. What I want to do here is I want to ensure that my face is always visible, because there is a potential that this grid area assigned to this image becomes shorter vertically, which means that it might cut off top of my head or something like that, and I never want this to happen, so I will actually position it to the top, which means that regardless of how small the area for this image gets, the top of the image will be shown, and that is exactly what the subject of this picture is, or my face. In any case, this is one solution to actually making this image stretch entirety of the available grid area. Another one would be to actually use grid's own properties, align self and justify self, and that is exactly what I'll show you next. So I will comment out the inline size and block size, and image is no longer taking the entirety of the grid area. What I can do here is I can position the contents of this particular grid area, which would be, well, this image, using the align self and justify self properties. Justify self is going to place that element on the inline axis, on the horizontal axis, and align self will position it on the vertical axis or on the block axis. So let's first do the align self, and let's set it to center. Now see that the content of this grid area is centered vertically, but what we can do is we can actually stretch it, and we want to do the same thing for justify self. We also want to set it to stretch. Justify self stretch, and this will now stretch the contents of our grid area horizontally and vertically to fill entirety of its space. It currently doesn't do that because we have image defined with the fixed height and width properties on the image itself. So instead of setting inline size and block size to 100%, we can only unset those values, which will actually tell the browser that we want to respect align self and justify self properties, and that way the grid itself will stretch this element. And this might not be relevant in this particular example, but I want to show you how this works. So when you're dealing with different elements within a certain grid area, you will know that you can make them fill entirety of the available area or position them to left, right, or however you want. And to actually make this work with this image, which has its own dimensions, we're going to set inline size and block size to unset, which will just tell the browser that we want to respect those properties defined here on the grid align self and justify self. And now our image is properly positioned exactly as we want it, and our grid is still not looking exactly as we would expect, but when we place more elements on this grid system, it will take shape, as you'll see momentarily. So right now I will copy all of those declarations using the right click, copy all declarations, and I will paste them into my CodePen editor because I want to persist those changes we made. There you go. And when I'm talking about copying values from developer tools, if you want to learn more about that, I have a video on developer tools, or specifically how to deal with CSS within developer tools. If you want to learn more about that, check that video. Link is going to be on the screen and in the description. So now that we have our image positioned, we want to position the next item on our list, which is going to be our headline. I will remove the display none property here. And now our headline is positioned automatically on the grid. Of course, that's not what we want. We want to position it somewhere on the right side so it overlays the image, but not entirely. I will select my headline element. I will enable the grid inspector here again. This is actually one downside of using CodePen. When you're tweaking values in the CodePen editor, your result view will be refreshed. This will then again disable the grid inspector that you've enabled previously. So that's why I'm mostly working within developer tools when we're tweaking values, and once we're done, then I'm copying this to my CodePen editor. What we want to do here is we want to position this headline somewhere around here. First, we will set grid columns, and I'm thinking we want to position it somewhere around column 5 to column something like 9, maybe somewhere around here, so it goes a little bit outside of the image, but not too much. So let's try this. Grid column, it will start at the column 5, and it will stretch all the way until column 9. There we go. And now we also want to tweak the grid row values, and here I'm going to set grid row, and we'll set it so it starts at the row 5, and it stretches all the way to the row 6, or only to the row 6. And you can see here that this element actually takes entirety of the available space. And in this particular example, we might not want to do that. We actually want to position it at the end of this area here. So I will actually use the align self property and set it to end. Now our headline is at the end of this area that we've created for it. And another thing that I forgot to mention a little bit earlier is that when you're dealing with the align self and justify self, there's actually a shorthand property that you can use instead. So I'm going to jump back to my image element. And here we have align self stretch and justify self stretch. I will remove those properties. And I can just use place self property, which is shorthand for align self and justify self. And if I specify it to stretch, we'll get exactly the same result as we've gotten before. There we go. If you want to use the same values for justify and align self, you can use place self as a shorthand. Our headline is now looking pretty much okay. So next thing that we want to do is we want to position our text. But before we do that, let's copy our headline values. I'm just going to copy the last 3 values here, and I will paste them at the end of my headline selector. Now let's show our text element, and I will select it on the screen. And we will want to position it under our headline slightly to the right. So we can set our text to something like maybe 6 to 11. So it will still overlap the image, but it'll be moved a little bit more to the right. On my text element, I will set the grid column, and it will stretch from column 6 to column 11. There we go. We also want to set grid row here. And we'll set grid row start to 6, and grid row start is going to be 8. What we need here is we actually need space between our rows, and to add space between our rows, we can use gap property, and we'll set this on our grid element right here. We'll set grid row gap, and we'll set it to something like 2 rem units. Let's see how this looks. And there we go. We have a nice space between our headline and our text. My face might now be partially obscured, but for this particular demo, let's leave it at that. And if we have a different viewport size, it might not be an issue at all. So if I, for example, hide my developer tools, you're going to see that there's no issue with that whatsoever. But if we have an issue with our text block, this is taking too much space, or again, it's filling the entirety of the available space, but we only want it to fill as much space as it has to. And we can do that by positioning it again using the aligned self property and set it to start. All right, this is already looking much better now. The next element that we want to position on our grid here is social media icons element. I will uncomment display none for this element. And we want to position those icons somewhere along the left edge of our element here, approximately at the height of our headline. First, we want to arrange those icons vertically. And as we already have display flex set on our icons list element, which is going to be UL selector, we can also change flex direction to column. There we go. And now we need to position this element on our grid. I will open my developer tools, and I will select my grid element and toggle the grid inspector. Our social icons element is positioned in the first row and first column, as you see. But if we want to position it exactly at the center of our edge, we want to position it at the center of an area that stretches from column 1 to column 3. So that's exactly what I'll do here. I'll set grid column property 1/3, and grid row is going to be 3/6. Only thing we want to do now is we want to position those icons to the center on our inline axis and to the end on our block axis. So justify self is going to be center, and align self is going to be end. There we go. Now this is now going to be aligned along with the bottom edge of our headline right here. And the space on our images is actually coming from our image element, because image element is an inline element and the line height will be applied to it. And we can avoid that by setting its display to block. There we go. And now there's not enough space between those elements, so I will increase the gap on our social icons list element from 0.3 rem units to 0.6 rem units. And this is a little bit better now. I will close developer tools, and this now looks much better than at the beginning and much more interesting. But the problem we have with this particular design is that this is not really responsive. So if I try to reduce the size of my window, you're going to see that this is definitely not what we want. So let's tweak our responsive version. And to do that, we will set a media query somewhere at the point when our design no longer looks okay. I will resize my window, and I will set the media query at the point where this is no longer looking properly, somewhere along here, maybe 1200 pixels. So let's set at media, maximum width is going to be 1200 pixels. And here we will place elements on our grid differently. Let's deal with our image first. I will add an image selector here. I will open developer tools, and I will inspect my grid again. And exactly as you remember, we have 12 columns here. And for this particular case, for our responsive version, we want our image to stretch from column 2 to column 12, because exactly as you see here, even though we have 12 columns, the last marker for column end is going to be 13. Grid column is going to start at column 2 and is going to span until column 12. And we also want to position our headline and text differently. We want to center those elements at the bottom edge of our image. So both our headline and our text should go from column 3 to column 11. So I will create headline, comma, text selectors, and we will set the grid column 3 to 11. And if I expect my grid again, for my taste, there's a little bit too much space between those rows. So I will reduce grid row gap on my grid element for the responsive version from 2 rem units to 1 rem unit. Grid row gap is going to be 1 rem unit. All right, this looks much better now. And if I resize my browser, as this headline and text are overlapping my image a little bit too much now, we actually want to tweak the row positioning for our both headline and text. So we'll move it a little bit lower. Our headline could be positioned as our text is right now and text underneath, which means that our headline is going to start at the row 6 and is going to end at the row 8, while our text is going to stretch from row 9 to row 12. Let's see how this looks. Headline, grid row is going to be 6 to 8, and text, grid row start is going to be 9, and grid row end is going to be 12. Okay, this looks much better right now. And if I close my developer tools and resize the screen, on a desktop we have this interesting effect where we're taking advantage of all the available space, but on our mobile sizes, we're aligning those a little bit more strictly, a little bit more like you would expect for a limited screen real estate. And one more thing that I want to address here is this gap between my headline and text. I think it's a little bit too big. We actually want text to start at row 8 and not 9 like I specified before. So I will tweak that and set text to span from grid row 8 to grid row 12. And of course, we can also tweak the headline size if we want, but for this particular demo, I think this should be good enough. So in this guide, I've shown you how to work with CSS Grid to place items exactly on the grid where you want them. And this should hopefully give you an idea how to achieve layouts that are a little bit more unconventional, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more creative. Thank you so much for your attention. My name is Zoran Jambor. I will see and hear you in the next grid column, or rather in the next video.